from the Nordic countries. If I can get this one to work before. Seems to be stuck with my, oops, that was. The Nordic countries are sometimes, and I would argue even quite often, and I think the Professor Bhaswati Sarkar hinted that from the beginning, that they are sometimes and even often seen as a successful group of foreign policy activists. They've been able to take advantage of new opportunities in the international realm, in particularly after the Cold War, but they did so also during the Cold War, and they've been able to meet the new challenges of globalization. If you look at the globalization index and various peace indexes, happiness indexes, the Nordic countries often come up at the top, and they almost always come up in the top 10 or the top 15 if one of them is doing particularly badly. So that prompts the question: what is it that we can learn from the Nordic countries? And I think in order to understand what we can learn, we need to think about what is the content of this Nordic success story. And I will get back to later on. It's not a success story without challenges. Also, as Professor Bhaswati Sarkar said in her introductory remarks, but it is a story of how reasonably weak actors can nonetheless gain influence in international affairs. And if we look at the content of the Nordic success story, I think we could point to at least three characteristics. The first one is promoting causes such as peaceful conflict resolution and human rights. So you could say these are basically what we would broadly think of as social liberal causes that fits well with the Scandinavian welfare states. That goes also for the second characteristic, combating poverty, global inequality, and environmental degradation. The Nordic countries, particularly Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, live up to UN goals for development aid. All the Nordic countries has as an explicit goal to combat global inequality. And the Nordic countries were some of the first countries in international relations were actually having part of their foreign policy also an environmental or climate policy. If we go back even to the 1970s, we will see this environmental aspect in Nordic foreign policies, and particularly as the Cold War ended, we would see the environmental factor also as a pillar in Nordic foreign policy. And then a third characteristic, which I think is quite important also, is that Nordic cooperation is often used as a platform for international influence and as a spread of Scandinavian welfare state values. So there's a double point or dual point in this. First, that these countries who have similar societal systems, in particular Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, which have very similar welfare states, they use that as a point of departure for cooperation. And second, also that their foreign policies reflect their domestic policies. So if we were if we are branding a company, we would say that the Nordic countries have authentic foreign policies. They seem to have what their external position reflects also their domestic position on various issues. That is perhaps not as much as it used to be, but it's still an important characteristic. And this characteristic is acknowledged also in various international indexes, but also by global, you might say, political leaders, public intellectuals. Francis Fukuyama wrote a book a few years back on the development of political institutions, and he said the goal of institutional development is in some sense getting to Denmark, and that was a country he saw as characterized by stable, accountable, and democratic institutions. Barack Obama, by the end of his 2 terms, invited all of Nordic leaders of government and state to a special dinner in the White House. And his speech, he said, these countries punch above their weight in their values, in their contributions not just to making their own countries function well, but to make the whole world a better place, makes them one of our most valuable partners everywhere in the world. So you might say, despite this welfare state or even social democratic foreign policy identity at times, they've also managed to be quite close partners with the United States. And that goes even if only 3 of the 5 Nordic countries are NATO members. Denmark, Norway, and Iceland were founding members of NATO, the Western Military Alliance. They were part of founding the alliance in 1949, whereas Sweden and Finland remain non-aligned countries, although cooperating closely with the United States, in particular Sweden, who's sometimes seen as a shadow member even of NATO, while having its own distinct foreign policy identity. So what characterizes this Nordic model? You might say it's both form and content. I spoke a little bit before about what characterizes the political content, but if we kind of zoom out and look at both form and content, one characteristic is that it's activist. If we look at the non-great powers of international relations in general, we would say they're generally quite defensive, pragmatic, looking to the great powers for how to navigate in international affairs. There are aspects of this also in Nordic foreign policies. Definitely, there's definitely a strong, you might say, pragmatic streak in Nordic foreign policy. They do not try to create the Danish or Swedish world order to replace the US world order. They know that they are smaller states, but at the same time, they seek to take advantage of this and take advantage of the domestic political constitution that they have. Activists seeking to influence the world. This activism is multidimensional. I think that's an important characteristic. It's military, economic, and diplomatic, and it relies on, and that's yet another aspect of Nordic societies. There's a strong cooperation between civil society and the state sector, and Nordic foreign policy also relies on a combination of government, civil society, international organizations. We see that in particular in development policy, of course. Then second, Nordic foreign policy is value-based. If you look at the values in Nordic foreign policy, you will see a reflection of the values that are the basis of their domestic societies, and that are welfare state values. You might call them social liberal, you might call them social democratic, but in the Nordic countries, they actually unite most of the political parties. So in the Nordic countries, we have political parties that are socialist, social democratic, conservative, liberal, but many of them will kind of, I would say, look towards the middle and look towards consensus and cooperation around these values, of course, with some differences. And of course, in all of the countries, there are also now more populist movements, and there are also fringes on both the left and the right. But most of the political parties, the center right and the center left, which always have a majority almost always have a majority in Nordic parliaments, they tilt towards values of egalitarianism, peaceful conflict resolution, rule of law, and collectivism. And there's also a strong responsibility for the collective, and it's also what is reflected in these environmental and climate policies. And yet, we should not overstate this, because as we can see in these states' policies that, for instance, Norway is also a big oil producer, while also branding itself as a green nation. Denmark has participated very actively in military operations led by the United States since the end of the Cold War, and still has a policy of pursuing a peaceful conflict resolution. So you can see there are the Nordic countries' foreign policies are no ideal types, as no country in the world has ideal type foreign policies. There are aspects of pragmatism, there are aspects of doing what you need to do in these policies, but in general, the grand strategies of these states will reflect these basic values, I would argue. And then there's a third aspect that we speak less about when you speak about the Nordic foreign policies, and that is actually that they're well endowed and well organized. If you want to take a leading role internationally, you need to have continuity and you need to have competence. And in order to have continuity and competence, you also need to have resources for your diplomatic services, for your government agencies, be able to attract good people. So to the extent that they've been able to take a leading role in developing and shaping UN policies, for instance, peacekeeping, this also goes back to their effective and non-corrupt bureaucracies, and also that these bureaucracies are quite well funded compared to many other countries. If we look at the development of the Nordic model, we would say that during the Cold War, we had a Nordic bloc of states. We had the Nordic countries cooperating, particularly in the UN. They were coordinating their votes. They were also coordinating resolutions, and they were voting together. And today we would see more of coordination than trying to agree. So the Nordic countries will actually agree on a number of issues, but they will still share information, and they will still know what each other are going to do, and they will also share information about the positions of other states, both in, for instance, in the EU and in the UN. So there's a great deal of trust between these countries and acknowledgement of the other states' position. After the Cold War, the activism has come out. For instance, in the EU, Denmark and Sweden played an active role in EU enlargements in the first decade after the Cold War. And if we look at it today, Norway has played a role in many peacemaking processes. Sweden and Finland have played a role, for instance, in non-military security issues in the EU, developing these policies, also policies on landmines. Denmark active on climate policy. Anti-piracy, Denmark has a big commercial fleet, so also an interest in this, and in military missions, and that goes for Norway also, despite the peacemaking, you might say. And together this means also that these countries most often will score in the top 10 of various surveys of national brands. So when we look at them from the outside, a lot of people would say, yes, the Nordics are doing quite well. We can see they have an agenda. They've been able to define an agenda that is recognizable. They've been able to produce a brand, if you want to use that concept, which is both recognizable but also resounds, with many other states and people around the world as something that is positive. Something positive is associated with this Nordic model. It's not perfect, but the branding, at least, is very good. And I would argue that the reason why you can do this branding is actually also because these values that foreign policy also, it's not a fake reflect domestic policy. So the success of the Nordic model in the post-Cold War world is by no means self-evident. I would say in the Cold War, as I mentioned before, they were acknowledged for UN activism, contributions to the developing world. They portrayed themselves very much as a third way between communism, the Soviet Union, and the capital. So this strong bond between the Nordic countries and even stronger cooperation than today, and an agreement or an attempt to find common positions at that time which we do not see so much today, where it's more sharing information. Sorry. The collapse of the Soviet Union then, and the emerging American or U.S. world order in the 1990s were actually led to an identity crisis in Nordic foreign policy. It used to be the third way between the East and the West. What are you when the East collapses and the West takes over? That was led to my colleague Ole Weber says that was a Nordic nostalgia during this period. The Nordics were longing back to the Cold War, in contrast to almost anyone else, and at least in contrast to anyone else in Europe, because they had occupied this particular political space during the Cold War. So how did the Nordics react to this? How did they reinvent themselves? They did that in two ways, I would argue. One was simply to accept pragmatically the new international order, adapt to Europeanization and globalization, working closely with European partners, but also with the United States. You might say they were normalizing their foreign policies. They were not as distinct as they used to be. Also normalizing their domestic policies, increasing competitiveness and resilience. And at the same time, this identity crisis also led them look inside Nordic societies and reinvent Nordicity, seeking to understand what are we as Nordics, what is particular about it, what is good about it, and this cultural revival, you might say, of Nordicity, that at a focus also both on design, on food, on stuff like that, but also on the values of Nordic society, such as gender equality, equal access to education and health services, and so on. So you might say the identity crisis led to a stronger understanding within the Nordic countries on what it means to be Nordic and what we value about it. There's a third explanation, and that is that the Nordics actually had quite strong and have quite strong resources in various niches. So there might be small countries, but also in some aspects very resourceful countries. Denmark has one of the biggest commercial fleets in the world if you compare tonnage. Norway is a big oil producer, and for that reason also extremely wealthy. Sweden has a long tradition as a middle power in European and global politics, as you might say, a moral great power, a very competent diplomacy, a strong tradition of working within international institutions. So even though there was you might say there's an identity crisis, at the same time, these were very resourceful societies, economically, institutionally, and diplomatically. A fourth explanation, you might say, was the historical development of the Nordic area. Might say call it history. You could, to some extent, call it luck, also, in the sense that the Nordic area has for long been what we used to call the quiet corner of Europe. It has been an area without wars among the Nordic countries for a very long time. Some of you might know of Karl Deutsch and his idea of security communities or clusters of countries where it's not only that they do not attack each other, it's that war has become unthinkable. And the Nordic countries have at least since the early 20th century been this security community, and some would trace it longer back also. So these countries have been able to develop and thrive in a peaceful area, not spend so many resources on the armed forces. They have a political culture which is very helpful when you negotiate internationally. It's a political culture which is pragmatic, consensus seeking. Most laws in the Nordic countries are made by a very, very big majority in parliament. Maybe 80–90% of parliament agree after long negotiations. And almost all laws of big importance are made in this way. So we don't have a big switch in policy when we have a new government, for better or worse. And then finally, we have this society model where foreign policy reflects also domestic values, and also the society model, which kind of factors in very nicely to the agenda that has been on human rights and development. So I think somebody needs to turn off the microphone.
I'm really sorry.
I know the problem. Will it last?
Professor Anders, you can unmute yourself.
Will the success last? Well, you might say that that all the Nordic countries thrive in the U.S. International order. They are now adapting to the changing of this order. What might come after? They're perhaps less on the U.S. international order than on the liberal order, at least some of them. They vary in their willingness to support the values of the liberal international order with military means. Denmark has been very willing, Finland not. Their value vary also in their ability to do so. Denmark has transformed its armed forces, so it fits very nicely with peacemaking and peacekeeping around the world. Iceland has no armed force, cannot contribute that much. Sometimes we might think that Denmark lives in the American world order or US world order, stressing US. Denmark is closer to the US than the other Nordic countries, while Sweden and the other countries, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Iceland, Sweden lives in the American world order, you might say, stressing order, and Norway, Finland, Iceland, and something in between. So Denmark closer to the US, Sweden very much a UN-focused countries, the other Nordic countries a bit in between. But even for Denmark, the UN plays a big role in foreign policy. It's a big deal for Denmark to play an active role in the UN, both in terms of human rights development and other issues. I can. Today, rather than one Nordic model, we might say there are different shades of the Nordic model, or even different Nordic models. Denmark is, as I said, military activist in the sense of peacekeeping and peacemaking around the world. Sweden has a feminist foreign policy, so in the program you will learn more about that later on. And Norway acts quite often as a rich, honest broker, seeking also to grease international negotiations with its wealth, putting that to good use internationally. We look at the Nordic international role and Nordic activism. There's perhaps one issue area where the Nordics are a little less activist. That is in Europe. We say sometimes they are reluctant Europeans, or even that they have the other European community. They have a community among themselves, but less with the rest of Europe. Two countries remain outside of the EU, Norway and Iceland, although they have very extensive cooperative arrangements. So in practice, they're part of the economic part of the EU, but outside many of the political arrangements. Two countries are members, but they have opt-outs. Denmark and Sweden are not part of the euro, the European currency. Denmark is also not part of European migration policy and defense policy. Finland used to be the good European in the Nordic cluster, but has now increasingly moved away from the EU mainstream. That does not mean that the Nordics do not work actively within the UN, but you see a reluctance in regard to the EU that you do not see in other institutional settings. You might say that within the EU, the Nordics have pursued their national interests pragmatically. There's not a Nordic alliance, more like a Nordic cluster. Again, they exchange information. They help each other on policy positions. They work together on particular Nordic issues, for instance, on labor market rules or on gender equalities, sometimes on the environment, also with Germany. Why is it that the Nordics are more kind of reluctant towards EU activism than activism in general internationally? I would argue that this is because sometimes the EU kind of inflicts or conflicts with the Scandinavian welfare state, which serves as a platform for non-entrepreneurship in other policy areas. The EU is so comprehensive in its cooperation that it weaves inside the domestic societies. It has implications for health policy, social policy, labor market policy, housing policy that are difficult for the Nordics to accommodate to without changing the cherished welfare state. Finally, is there something that other states could learn from the Nordic success story? I would argue that there are some general takeaway points from the Nordic case. First, an emphasis on soft power. If you're not a strong military power, perhaps even sometimes if you are a strong military power, you can get a long way with non-coercive strategies and non-entrepreneurship. That is emphasizing negotiation and consensus seeking rather than seeking to pressure or to threaten your way through international diplomacy. Also, what the Nordics have done, I think, in many ways, in a clever way, is playing into the existing international discourses. That is kind of the pragmatic aspect. You might say sometimes they've been too pragmatic, too accommodating towards the great powers. Sometimes always towards the US, you might say, or quite often towards the US, but also sometimes towards China or Russia. But what we have done in many of the softer policy areas are acting as a benchmark. And what do I mean by this? I mean that internationally, if you are not a strong military power, and sometimes even if you are a strong military power, and you want to get influence, one very powerful way of doing that or enhancing your negotiation position is if you can point to that you're doing yourself what you preach that others should also do. So, for instance, for the Nordic countries in their development policies, in their climate policies, they have worked actively to have policies themselves that they could point to and say, here we have some experience ourselves, for instance, with wind turbines as an energy source, that we can show that it can actually work to have a greener economy. So that's very useful in informal negotiations. It gives you status in these negotiations. It gives legitimacy also to playing information into the process, because you can base your own policies on your own experiences. What I think we should note in regard to the Nordic experience is they have strong resources, and they're willing also to allocate a significant part of their societal resources to having I think a strong state sector, but also strong diplomacy here, which is also competent and also non-corrupt, because partly also because it's well endowed. They have acted with competence, so they focus on the areas where they have competence to contribute. They have what I would call mainstreaming with a twist, that they do not challenge basic discourses of the great power, but they play in their own agendas within these discourses. And then they see their policies as a long-term investment. They have policies, the policy positions are basically stable. The policy positions we have in my foreign policy we have in my own country, Denmark, basically has had the same priorities since the end of the Cold War, no matter which government was there. And these are the the aspects of the policy that I mentioned before. It is about peacemaking. It's about climate and environmental policy. It's about human rights policy. It's about playing this into international institutions when possible, but also working pragmatically with great powers when necessary. What should you be aware of if you have this kind of strategy? Well, if you work closely with great powers and you play your own policy position into the great powers' policy positions, when the great powers change their agenda, as we saw with the US during the Trump era, then you're really challenged in your policy. Beware of contaminating your brand politically, administratively. The migration policies, for instance, of Denmark, has sometimes been controversial and seems to contradict these basic values of society. And then one thing we should always reflect critically upon, I think, is the lack of parameters for success, because we're all these great indexes of peace and happiness and green energy and so on. But I mean, these can give us kind of a say, well, there's something here we should look into, but we should always look at these indexes and branding with some dose of skepticism. So these words, thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Professor Bhaswati.
Unmute myself. Yes, sorry. Thank you for this excellent presentation. Very comprehensive view about the Nordic, foreign policy, bringing out many aspects here. I think in the morning session, the ambassadors also pointed out how the Nordics, when they come together, because of the brand, as you call it, the brand that they have created, they are able to be global players and they are able to punch much above their weight. I think that came out very clearly in your presentation. Just before we open up for questions, I think I sort of got very interested in the way you sort of connected the domestic values and the foreign policy projections, where again, towards the end, you hinted to some discrepancy, which can be now seen, increasingly seen in those values itself, right? Especially when we are looking at Denmark. The kind of problems with immigration and integration that it faces. So now how that relates to its projections, that would be interesting to see. And whether when you talk about Nordicity, which is basically invention or basically coming to terms with your own Nordic identity in the post-Cold War period. Mm-hmm. So how does that Nordic identity look at the other? That would be interesting to see, but I won't take time. I'll open up the floor for questions because I can see in the chat box a few questions have come in. And for your information, Professor, you have reached to 114 participants.
Oh, nice. So in the chat, is any of you moderating the questions?
Yes, Nikhil is moderating.
Yes. Thank you. I would request Professor to stop your share screen. And so we have some 6-7 questions, but we'll see how many we can take up. The first question is by Upasana Ghosh. She says, would you say that the recent rise of populist parties in Nordic countries occurred because of the welfare state values or despite the welfare state values?
I think that that in the Nordic countries, as in many other countries in the world and in the West, we've seen an increase in the populist vote over the past decade, and I would say that is it because of or is it in spite of? I would say it's because of and in spite of, perhaps, because I would say that one aspect of it in the Nordic countries, as we've seen also, for instance, in Britain and the United States, France, and other places, is that we have groups of people. Often living in rural areas, maybe former industrial areas, that see themselves marginalized in the globalized economy, and an economy which has been less based on industrial production in the West in recent decades. So I think that's definitely part of it, which is an international trend which we see in Europe and and North America, which the Nordic countries are also part of. I think also in the Nordic countries, I think in some sense this is cushioned by the welfare states. We do not feel it as much as in the welfare state. I think many of these people are perhaps a little less extreme than QAnonons and so on. I don't think we'll see like a revolt on the parliaments in any of the Nordic countries as we saw in the US, or violent demonstrations to that extent, because there is a greater degree of equality and also of community in that sense. But at the same time, you also have in these areas and in these groups also the sense that we have such a big welfare state. It's directed from Copenhagen, and it's perhaps less and less attentive to us and more attentive to the people closer to the center and closer to the decision makers. So I think in that sense, part of it is also resentment against aspects of the welfare state. But I think if you see, for instance, the what we call the Danish People's Party in Denmark, for instance, are not against the welfare state, although very skeptical towards migration, and very much focused also on the rural areas and old age pensioners and so on. So there are different grades of this.
Okay, so we have 3 questions which are related to the Arctic region. I'll just call out one and then add the other questions. So Mool Parveen writes that while there is an earnest desire of Nordic countries to engage in bilateral cooperation with China, for instance, the establishment of Arctic Research Observatory in Iceland and plans to establish Chinese research station in Greenland, there is also considerable apprehension vis-a-vis Chinese engagement in Arctic region in the light of Chinese maritime claims in South China Sea, which contradicts the UN law and sea, and which paradoxically China has ratified. China affirming itself as a near Arctic state and its inclusion of the Arctic routes, and it's very ambitious. The Belt and Road Initiative has further contributed to the apprehension. So is there any common Nordic foreign policy regarding this issue, or any dialogue that has taken place between regional organizations such as Arctic Council, the Northern Dimension, etc., and China? Rajiv Ranjan has also asked Nordic foreign policy on Chinese engagement in the Arctic and with China as well. And also with respect to Arctic region, Mohammed Shafiq has also asked how Nordic countries contain Russian threats. Are they still dependent on the US? So yeah, you can compile the whole thing. Yeah.
I think the Nordic countries are very much dependent on the US in the Arctic, or in Denmark we tend to call it the Arctic. In Norway they tend to call it the High North, but very much dependent on the US also because these areas are simply so big. So for smaller states like us with the small armed forces, it's simply difficult to surveillance in these areas. So we need cooperation with NATO allies, in particular the US. I think there's always been skepticism towards Russia in the Arctic, although Russia in the Arctic has acted with significantly less hostility than it has done in other parts of its near abroad geopolitical neighborhood. Then there's always been the skepticism towards Russia, and of course we also have the legacy of the Cold War, where you had the fault line between the East and the West very close to here. I think on China, the position is changing. I think there's for some years there was a very welcoming attitudes towards China on many issues, and there's definitely a trend now towards greater skepticism and also of nervousness in regard to Chinese influence on critical infrastructure. So I think there's definitely a trend towards more skepticism, and you saw that also when the Chinese offered in Greenland to buy a new harbor, and then the Danes then they said that they would actually pay for it. They wouldn't pay for it before the Chinese made this offer, but after the Chinese made the offer, they would like to pay for it because they would like, of course, to avoid the Chinese interference. And there was a strong indications that this Danish position was coordinated also with the United States, who like to be kind of the great power that is positioned in Greenland and the Arctic with as little rivalry as possible.
Okay, Professor, we have time for one more question, I guess. So it's a question by Akanksha. She's saying that, could you please throw some light on the similarities of Nordics with the Baltic states? Because in recent past, these three countries have been associating with Nordic more, looking at Nordic countries as a model countries to follow, especially to deal with challenges related with economy or border security.
I think there are some, I think that in the Nordic countries, there's, you might say, the feeling of a strong similarity of, you might say, of having connected destinies with the Baltic countries, being small countries this close to Russia. And there's also a great concern in the Nordic countries towards kind of Russia challenges or threats to the Baltics. So in that sense, there's this sense of community, and the Nordic countries and the Baltics also cooperate on many different aspects. I think if you look at the societal models, they're somewhat different. The Baltic countries do not have the same kind of welfare states as the Nordic countries. They've chosen another economic societal model, but still there's this sense of community and the need to work together in the Baltic Sea area for the benefit of all of us, I think.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much for answering our questions. We have a couple of more. You can take them in the chat. We would like to move further to our second lecture. Yes, thank you so much. I would like my colleague Ravneet to take over and introduce the next speakers. I would ask the team to spotlight the next speakers and remove spotlight from me.
Hello, am I audible? Hello?
Yes, Ravneet, you're audible.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Nordic Summer School. The next speakers that we have for this second session, we have, which will be on the Nordics, regional security and outlooks on the global Asian affairs. For the first one we have is Stina Torjesen. Stina Torjesen holds a DPhil International Relations from the University of Oxford and is an associate professor at the School of Business and Law, University of Adger. She has served previously as a senior research fellow at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs and is a current member of the Norwegian Labour Party's International Committee. I welcome Stina on the behalf of Nordic Summer School and our JNU community. And the next speaker that we have in the session is Miss Anita Pratap. She is a writer. She's an international writer and a journalist. She is a former South Asian bureau chief of CNN and Time magazine. She is now based in Norway and has worked in Europe, United States, India, Saudi Arabia, and Japan. She has covered breaking news stories ranging from Siachen glaciers and the world's highest battlegrounds between India and Pakistan, the wars in Afghanistan and Sri Lanka. She has a book to herself named Island of Blood on the war in Sri Lanka. She has also won several Indian and international awards. She has been awarded a prestigious American George Pollock Award for her coverage of the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. I welcome you, ma'am, on behalf of Nordic Summer School and JNU. So I would like to give you the stage to start your lecture. Thank you.
I think Professor Bhaswati wants to say something first and then.
Yeah, finally I've been unmuted.
Yeah.
Hello, Stina. Good to see you here. I I'm absolutely delighted that you have joined us. And this is again for the information of all the participants. Professor Stina has been really very supportive. I shared the idea of this series of lectures with her. And she said, as I said in the inaugural session too, that she said it's absolutely doable. We can do it, and immediately put me in touch with her colleagues. And that is how we are here today. I really am very thankful that we have been able to put this together. And you have also, connected us to Miss Anita Pratap. And I think we are going to have a very good conversation. You are going to take it in a conversation mode, I believe, right? Okay, I'll leave it to both of you, and after we'll just keep about 15 minutes for the discussion. Thank you once again. Thank you, Stina.
Stina, I think you have to unmute yourself.
I think I'm okay. Sorry. Great. Thank you, Anita. Thank you so much, Bhaswati. It's such a pleasure to be part of this, and I think it's such an exciting program. And I think from a Nordic perspective, this is just an amazing initiative, and I think we're just very thankful that you're doing this. And I'm also very thankful that I get to do this together with Anita. And as you're saying, Bhaswati, what we're trying to do, it's just to kind of break it up a little bit. I think sometimes it's good to have a conversation rather than a monologue. So Anita and I, we will do a bit back and forth with questions and answers, and then we will still do the 15 minutes questions. But first, let's do our 30 minutes. So you've already from the previous session, you have already touched clearly on key issues in Nordic security issues and Nordic and the political trends in the Nordics. So we apologize if we rehearse some of the points. Let us know in the chat if it's too much of a duplication, but I think we will be able to steer this in a way that is valuable for you. And also just to say finally before we start, it's very nice to see some familiar JNU names in the chat and in the participants. So that's really great. But anyway, Anita, maybe you start with firing off a question, and then we get going.
Okay, but first, thank you so much, Bhaswati and Ravneet, for that lovely introduction. And it is wonderful to be with you all. JNU was an old hunting ground of mine, so it is with great. I would have loved to be with you all personally, but this is the next best option. Great to be with you all, and it's wonderful to be with Stina as well, whose work I truly admire. So we will do it in a Q&A format, simply because I think that makes it more conversational and interesting. So the thing is, the first thing that strikes you is when you're sitting in New Delhi and you think of the Nordics, you think of this, it's a very homogeneous area, which is, a lot of Europeans with living in small countries, living in peace and security and prosperity, and in one, remote, cold corner of the planet. That's, it seems they're all pretty much the same, but actually they're very different. And if you look closely, you will find that they are so different that they can be confusing. So my first question to Stina is that, when they're all Europeans, but not all the Nordic members are part of the European Union. They are Europeans, but they're not members of this Nato alliance, which is the defense alliance. So what explains these differences?
Yeah, great, thank you. So good point, exactly. There are some really key differences. And if we take them kind of one step at a time, if we do NATO membership first, which you may have already touched on, but as you know, it's both Denmark and Norway and Iceland are NATO members, and then Finland and Sweden are not NATO members. I think on the part of Sweden, there is this long, very successful tradition of neutrality. Sweden and all of the Nordic countries were neutral in the First World War, which served them well. But then moving into the Second World War, it's only really Sweden that managed to stay neutral in the Second World War and to kind of thrive in that setting. So I think that's one reason why Sweden saw that this worked very successfully for them, but it has come at a cost. They have had to invest very heavily in their own defense structures. So that explains the choice of Sweden, which is the odd one out really in this question. But then for the others, it's really about Russia and different ways of relating to Russia and to this really, as Anita, you've put it as well, at this very powerful neighbor, where the Nordic countries are in a very, very inferior, very weak, small state position in relation to Russia. And how do you kind of mitigate that? And I think Finland has mitigated it by pleasing Russia and doing what Russia wants, and the Soviet Union wanted, which was to be non-aligned and to stay neutral. I think that was the best way for Finland to safeguard Finnish security, because they were bordering Russia and they understood that Russia had special expectations towards Finland. And you could read the Swedish answer the same way, that Sweden as well balances Russia, and their neutrality again maybe is also a way to please Russia somehow. But that's very clearly in the Finnish choice. And then Denmark and Norway, if you want, they maybe had the privilege, in a sense, being not as close to Russia. I mean, Norway borders Russia very briefly up north, but they were slightly more remote, and I think they had the opportunity to align with NATO, and they took that opportunity, and they feel that has served them very well. So, but the underlying issue here is still these small Nordic states navigating the fact that you've had a very powerful, at some point threatening Soviet Union, and then in parts or in periods threatening Russia. How do you navigate that? What alliances do you build? And I think Norway and Denmark has had the opportunity to take NATO membership, and they've really invested very heavily in that, as has done Iceland as well, which is also heavily investing and facilitating a membership. These countries then are, of course, particularly in the Cold War, they were very strategically located because of the North Sea, etc. So they were also a big bonus, if you like, for the NATO alliance and for the US to have them on board. And there are these stories that the Norwegian defense minister at the height of the Cold War really had very close access and open access to Washington because of its strategic location. So that's the NATO membership. Anita, it sounds okay? Anything to add there? Or?
No, I mean, we have to talk a little more about Russia, because Russia is the big bear in the Nordic room, so to speak, and it's it's a giant, it's a neighbor, it's big, it's powerful, and the Nordics have shown a peculiar tendency of dealing with Russia in a way which is, there is cooperation and there is conflict. Yeah. So how have they been managing to navigate this?
Yeah, that's a good point. Exactly. So that's, in a way, it's a puzzle. I mean, you're all specialists in international relations, and particularly if we look at the world from very kind of realist perspectives. There's usually just one story being told. Okay, they are enemies. They are it's a big security dilemma. They're trapped. Things are very scary, and Norway has to kind of fend for itself and protect itself against Russia, for example. But in reality, it's a very mixed story. So you have this layer of kind of security issues underneath, and the choice of alliances that these Nordic members have made. But at the same time, they've also done really well in engaging with both the Soviet Union and with Russia on key issues that needed to be solved. And one such example is the managing of fishery resources in the high north. So there's abundance of kind of cod, and it's a very kind of rich oceans when it comes to marine resources. But in the 70s, there was a danger that these oceans would be there were overfishing in these waters. And then there's been a long tradition of the Nordic states negotiating with Russia, putting together scientific committees, for example, that have jointly monitored fish stocks and then set proper targets and quotas for maximum amounts of fish to be taken out of the ocean in particular years. And that's a kind of continuous operation that's being done where there's a machinery of cooperation really between the Nordic states and Russia. And when it comes to fish, it's particularly Norway and Russia that does that. So there is a kind of there are some kind of constant themes where you do have continuous cooperation, even if there is an underlying fear, if you like, of Russia. So fish is the best example, but you also see it partly in energy, you see it in environmental issues, that there also has been engagement. But having said that, there has also, if you look back on the last 20 years, there's been some really tough periods. And particularly I see from your chat, one of you is raising the 2014 Russian invasion of the Crimea. That has been a really down, that's a real down, that's a real downturn in Russian Nordic relations. And in a sense, this kind of increasing aggressiveness, I think, that we've seen in the more kind of late Putin period, with cyber attacks, undermining the US democracy, as we know. So that's really soured relations pretty badly. So we've had some tougher years, I think, with Russia. Also more tensions with Russia, but again, these kind of fundamental issues of, again, managing fish, for example, continues even in the worst years. Anita, yeah.
So it just shows that disputes don't have to lead to war. That's the whole way of trying to manage the differences.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. No, it doesn't have to lead to war, and in a way, and then you can explain it in different ways. Is it because the Nordic states have been so good at kind of reading Russia and engaging with Russia that they kind of managed to kind of build trust and a dialogue and predictability? That's one explanation, which would be a very liberal explanation if you want to. Another explanation could be that Russia has always defined these territories as independent, a kind of no-go area, that it's really the Baltics, it's Ukraine, that's the kind of remit of their great powerness. So that's kind of kept them safe regardless. Or a third reading would be that it is actually the presence of NATO, both through the membership of Iceland, Norway, and Denmark, and these more kind of, and by that, there is this NATO protection, if you like, of the Nordics, and that's kind of given a more kind of clarity and predictability, and also made the Nordics able to kind of balance firmly against Russia. So there are different readings to that, but the core of it is, as you point out, that cooperation is indeed possible even at times of kind of adversarial relations, if you like. Yeah.
That's so from the Nordics, let's move to Norway, as we've been discussing now, because as we all know, Norway is the center of the planet.
Yes.
Of course, jokes apart, Norway is a tiny country in terms of population, just 5.3 million, but it punches way above its weight in international affairs. So Stina, tell us, what role does Norway seek to build in the international arena?
Yeah, exactly. So great question. And it's a big question. So what are they trying to do? And I think they're trying to kind of acknowledge its kind of small stateness, and the status as a small state. And the other key thing with Norway, which distinguishes Norway from the other members, is of course that they're not part of the EU. So I think so Sweden and Denmark, they can shape global affairs to a much larger extent by trying to kind of to shape the direction of the EU and be a good EU member and an effective diplomatic power within the EU. That's a main arena for Finland, Sweden, and Denmark. They're doing really well in shaping both the internal politics of the EU, the market, the new Green Deal, for example, pushing, making sure that Europe kind of move from fossil fuels to renewable energy, and kind of creating these incentives for that, and making sure that European industries remain competitive within that. So Finland, Sweden, Denmark, they're really driving that agenda within the European Union. And then they're driving the global agenda as well, together with many of the other powers as well, of trying to make the EU a power that kind of upholds norms, very much together with India, upholding norms, human rights, international law in general, and kind of pushing for that. So Sweden, Finland, and Denmark can work through the EU to achieve that, and also to create, again, safety, create beneficial context for them. Whereas Norway does not have the privilege of being an EU member, and in that sense is more vulnerable ultimately on the international stage. Security-wise, we've kind of sorted ourselves out because we have the NATO membership. But NATO, it's one big forceful military tool, but it does not necessarily solve all the kind of complex everyday issues of that constitutes international affairs. And how do you have weight in international affairs? And when you're trying to seek deals or push through whatever is your interest, how do you achieve that without having anything to back you? And I think what the project that Norway has been doing is to involve itself heavily in the international sphere, to try and be a problem solver where it can. So that's why it's really engaged in peacemaking very forcefully. I think this kind of the role of being a peace negotiator in Palestine, Israel, for example, Colombia, Sri Lanka, less fortunately so, but they've taken these chances to play, to kind of provide some public goods, for example, helping out in peace negotiations, or they have this long tradition of supporting Gavi, for example, the Global Health Fund, and also the vaccination efforts long before the Corona efforts. So I think they've been searching for ways to be able to play the role of a public goods provider when it's possible, in order to kind of create a role for themselves, really, and create visibility, build networks in the international arena, so as to compensate for the fact that by the end of the day, it's a small state that is actually pretty alone in the world.
Right. I mean, as you mentioned, peace building is a wonderful and noble exercise, but sometimes it backfires, as we saw, for instance, when the Norwegian Nobel Peace Prize Committee awarded the prize to the Chinese dissident Liu Xiaobo, and the relations between Norway and China then turned very difficult. How was this handled and repaired, or what is the status?
Yeah, what is the status on with the China and the Nobel Prize issue? I was just reading the chat as we talked. We have a few questions in the chat, but which are very good. How do they repair that? So, so first of all, the Nobel Peace Prize, it's a fully independent organization. So it's a committee that kind of comes out of the Norwegian Parliament. So it's the political parties that appoints people to sit in the committee. But once the committee is kind of inaugurated or created, it's fully independent. So the government can never really control. They have no say of who they decide to give the Peace Prize to. But it so happened that 1 year they gave it to Liu Xiaobo, the Chinese dissident, which created major repercussions for Norway. And we can speculate that this perhaps was a good opportunity for China to discipline a state outside of Asia for kind of attacking or for meddling in internal affairs and engaging too much, in a sense, in the human rights agenda within China. And again, it may be that Norway was vulnerable again because we're not an EU member. That's a personal speculation, but I think it served China well to kind of make an example out of Norway and say, if you engage in that way, if you start engaging in our internal politics and engaging with fronting this human rights and political agenda really internally in China, it's going to cost you. And it did. Norway was really kind of frozen out of any contact with China. We were about to sign a free trade agreement that was just completely put on hold. And not least our exports, one of our big export items, our salmon, fish, was really just was more or less stopped, which had not an extreme cost, but had a cost to some some segments of the Norwegian economy. So that was the situation, but that was rectified. And again, we could tie it to we could speculate that at the time when Norway becomes we have now the chair of the Secretary General of NATO is Jens Stoltenberg, the former Prime Minister. It may be that I think it's China itself calculated, for reasons we don't really know yet, but China itself calculated that now it was the time to kind of bring Norway in and to open up again for more amicable relations with Norway. So I think Norway had a kind of constant diplomacy trying to kind of reach out and reestablish contact. I think they were asked many times to really acquiesce and to kind of to promise good behavior. I think that was resisted by Norway, but I think after we've had a thaw, we're now back again with fairly okay relations with China. But I think now what is distinguishing Norwegian foreign policy to China is then perhaps overly timid or overly we're perhaps overly careful, I think, in our engagement with China at present.
But do you think Norway is not part of the EU, but is Norway's approach to China aligned with the EU's approach to China?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, it is. I mean, I personally, I think it should be even more aligned with the EU approach. So I think what we can, so either you can think of the EU as the big organization, and then you can think of EU as the member states, right? And the member states both have their independent foreign policy, and at the same time they come together and have that overall global foreign policy of the EU. At the moment, the way in which the EU relates to China, I think, resembles key strategic thinking in both Paris with France and key strategic thinking on the part of Berlin and Germany. And I think both of them at this moment in time in 2021, they have decided to maintain good economic relations with China, and to have a softer stance on China than the current both President Trump and President Biden. So the key thing that happened this year was really the signing of the investment treaty between China and the EU, which is not fully ratified yet, but that is a sign that both Germany and France, for the moment, is seeking to maintain a kind of tight economic cooperation with China, even as it's understanding that some sectors we have to guard some sectors, IT, other security-related sectors has to be guarded. And I think there are also an understanding that increasingly, I think there will be a tougher tone between European nations and China, because I think the human rights abuses in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, and I think the situation in Hong Kong is kind of increasingly dawning on European policymakers that this is very, very far from European values, and it's increasingly problematic. So I think there is an acknowledgement that there are that there are fundamental differences between China and the EU, but so far the EU has chosen to kind of acknowledge the differences, but seek to maintain this economically integrated situation where you have a lot of Chinese investments still going to Europe, you have European investments going to China, and that very tight trading relationship. So I think they're seeking to continue that. Whereas I think on the part of the EU, the US is signaling that they are willing to risk it, and has a much more open, this strategic competitive relationship with China. And so that is the European situation. And I think Norway I think that's a comfortable position for Norway at the moment. I think Norway mirrors to a large extent the way in which Germany relates to China. I'm not sure if it's conscious in that sense, but I think it's a very comfortable position to be in, to kind of dovetail on what Germany is doing at the moment with China. What's your sense there? Yeah, what do you think, Anita?
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I mean, I mean, basically there are these European values under which they, work when it comes to values, but there is also pragmatism when it comes to economic alliances. Yeah. So that seems to be. Now we have only about 5 minutes left for this discussion before we take questions from the audience. But let's just move quickly to India. Why? Yes. Because India is the center of the universe. Yay. So Stina, tell us, why is India important to Norway?
Yeah, I think, so I realized, so today, I mean, you've heard actually all of the ambassadors talk, and I'm sure they've highlighted that a number of issues where India and Norway India and the Nordics are important. If we take Norway, India, I think again this shared sense of I think the fundamental issue is this idea that both India and the Nordic countries, including Norway, are very much fundamentally committed to upholding as much as you can of the liberal international order, and at least an international order that is governed on treaties, on international law, on multilateralism, of seeking out compromises and building international arenas, and kind of coming together in international arenas to make compromises. And that is, I think, all of the Nordic countries have high hopes that really India is a power that can kind of uphold those norms as we move forward. And I think for Norway then to build and work with India on that, I think is extremely important for Norway, because it's fundamentally aligned with the kind of world order that Norway wants to build, but which we are fundamentally unable to build ourselves because we are a tiny power. But the fact that India is kind of engaged in the same project, I think is very comforting for the Nordic states and for Norway. So that's the kind of fundamental issue. And then I think there are these other spheres as well that are really important. I think it's on climate change. There's a lot of common goals when it comes to climate change and common agreement. And I think, again, when we look specifically at Norway, India, in these coming 2 years, they're both in the Security Council together, which I think that brings them very close together. And my understanding is that they're also here again very much aligned on a number of issues and can play on each other's strength when it comes to their Security Council role in these particular years. Good. What's your sense there, Anita?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's what Bill Clinton said a long time ago, that India is the theater of all the global problems. Any problem in the world, you will find it in India. India is the microcosm. And therefore, without India's involvement, you cannot solve global challenges. That was his, and I thought that was really, well put. One last quick question before you start taking the questions. How should we evaluate the Norway-India relationship? Is it successful? Is it a failure? Is it challenging?
I mean, I think that's a really open question. I'd be interesting to hear both what's your sense of it, Anita, and maybe others as well. I think it's I think so far it has a lot of promise. I think from a Norwegian perspective, I think there should be much more investment in building relations with India. I think clearly we do see signs when it comes to digital or energy issues. There are already kind of nascent or growing cooperation, but I think there's much more to be done there. And I think there's much more to be done when it comes to research and ocean related issues. So there are dialogues there. There are initiatives that are going on. My sense though is, I think if we look 20 years ahead, I mean, India, as you're saying, or even at the time of Bill Clinton, or even now, India is a major player on the international scene. I think 20 years from now, it will be even more so. And I think the importance of India will be even bigger. Also, again, from a very, very kind of self-centered European perspective, because of the emphasis on democracy and rule of law. So that makes it a hugely important player in the globe. And for those reasons, I think Norway should spend much more resources and have it much higher on the agenda than we do. It is on the agenda, but it should just be much higher. So for me, I think there's my sense that it's untapped in a sense, that potential, but that has to do with the Nordics. I don't think that has to do with India. And again, from an Indian perspective, I mean, we're minor. We are more or less irrelevant for Indian foreign policy making. So it's up to the smaller party, the Nordic states, to really engage with India and pull India and build that dialogue. What's your sense there? You've followed this much longer than I have. What's your sense?
No, but I agree with you. You put it absolutely. In a nutshell, it's a bang on. This is exactly the issue. There is an asymmetry here because of Norway is very small and it cannot mass produce goods that India needs. And as far as India is concerned, Norway is really small. So, it's not an interesting market. But then I think international relations is not about just market. It is important, but there are other things. And I think there, as I mentioned earlier, Norway punches way above its weight. And why is that? I mean, this is a country with 5.3 million people. That is the size of South Delhi, JNU and its surroundings. Yes. That is the size of this country. But it is the #1 country in the Quality of Life Index that the United Nations has, the HDI. #1 country. It is the #1 country. Its sovereign wealth fund is the biggest in the world, $1 trillion, which is basically from the oil revenues that is kept for current generation as well as future generations. Stina mentioned about the salmon exports to China. I mean, this tiny country is actually producing and exporting, is the world's second largest exporter of fish, the third largest exporter of oil and gas after Saudi Arabia and Russia, is the fifth biggest shipping nation. I mean, it's quite incredible. And I think people don't understand that because, like Stina, all the other Norwegians are very modest. Give this kind of statistics to us Indians, where we would have taken it, you know? So this is the issue, but there is something to be learned about the way Norway has handled resources, has invested in its people, provided good education and healthcare and safety and good public services. I think these are also very important things that the rest of the world also, you know, should look into, because life is not just about GDP. It's, you know, also about the quality of life and what matters to ordinary citizens. So I think with that, we will end this session with the Q&A, and
Yes.
Perhaps the questions can be taken up.
Yeah.
Thank you for such a great session. Before taking up the questions, I would like to call in Professor Bhaswati Sarkar for thank you note to the speakers.
So can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, because I was muted. I thought I was muted for good. Thank you, Stina, and thank you, Anita. I think this was a very useful way of doing this, session. This is what Stina had suggested, and I think this is really something which has gone off very well. All the things that needed to be discussed have come out, and it is in a conversation style. And I think there are many questions which have come up, which you need to address. So on to the questions. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
So do you want to, Ravneet, will you read the questions from the chat, or do you want us to do it directly, or that's?
I can read the questions for you.
Yeah,
that's
perfect.
not a problem. Yes. The first
I think you can club a few questions together, Ravneet, for the sake of time and taking up more questions.
Yeah, 3 at a time. That's good. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So we have a question from Sudikshdeep Sarkar. So this question is, what is the reason behind Norway resisting an EU membership? Is it grounded in the sense of nationalism? And then we have from Lopamudra Ghosh, which says, what makes it hard for the Nordic country to continue being peripheral in adopting the policy of desecuritization? And then we have another one which says, how is the growing Euroscepticism among the Nordic countries changing their influence on the international affairs?
Mm-hmm. Great.
So if you can answer these first.
Yeah, that was a nice bundle. Thank you. So I'll do the easiest one first. So the reason why Norway resisted EU membership. Yeah, so they resisted twice in 1973 and in 1994. That's the first time I voted myself. I voted in the EU referenda, and I voted yes. And I'm still very sad. And the reason why Norway said no, it's basically rooted in it's two things. One is independence. So Norway only gained independence from Sweden in 1905. It was ruled by Denmark first for 400 years, and then it was ruled by Sweden for 100 years. So it was a young nation, and that kind of idea of holding on to sovereignty and not kind of ceding sovereignty to a supranational body was a very powerful argument for many Norwegians that made them skeptical. But the other major issue was the strength, really, of the farmer, both the fish lobby, the kind of the political force that the fisheries constitute in Norway, and the political force that the farms and the kind of countryside alliances in Norway constitute. So they came together. They were very skeptical of the big European market. Norwegian agriculture would be outcompeted inside the European market because our agriculture is terrible. It's a very cold country, and it's hard for the farmers to survive in an open, competitive environment. So it was that. And again, with the fisheries, they were afraid that they would have to share the oceans with Spanish and French fishermen. which in fact they didn't. I mean, there was a clause in the eventual agreement in '94, but still all of those concerns tipped Norway slightly towards no. So Norway said no, whereas Finland, Sweden, and Denmark said yes. So that's the answer to that. So it partly is nationalism. And then the other questions on the growing Euroscepticism among the Nordic countries changed their influence in international affairs. Well, I'm not sure the status of Euroscepticism. I think it's a very mixed, the population and the political outlook on Europe and the importance of Europe and Brussels and the EU. It's very divided. And you have a kind of a populist wing in all of these countries. But you have also very forceful pro-European camps as well. And not least, I think in Denmark and Sweden, after Brexit, which I think has served as a kind of horror example, that it's very difficult to disengage from Europe. I think that has strengthened the idea of Europe. I don't know what you think. What's your sense?
2015, when there was this huge influx of immigrants, right-wing nationalism really took off in Europe. So that was 2015, and it went really strong for the next, several years. In a way, quietly. Netherlands, all these countries was very strong with far-right populism. But then, as Stina said, Brexit was the real dampener, because they saw how difficult it is, how expensive it can be. And therefore, you find today that a lot of the same forces that had vocally supported, breaking off from the EU, Frexit and Nexit and Grexit and all these, many, as you say, we say in Delhi, Hajar, exits. All of them, have now quietened down a great deal, because now people see the reality.
Yeah, exactly. Great. And the final question there is on what makes it hard for the Nordics to continue being peripheral and adopting a policy of desecuritization, right? That was the third one. Well, my sense is today they're not trying to be peripheral. They're definitely trying to be as much get into the center stage of global politics as they can, given their limited size and resources. But I think the important thing is that there was, so particularly for Norway, from the period 1905 to 1914, there was an explicit, this was precisely the policy of Norway, to stay peripheral, to not build up a big defense, and to just kind of stay, below the radar, be a kind of peaceful peripheral nation that was commercially engaged, but otherwise completely out of the kind of security setup in Europe. But they kind of, they tried very hard to do that, and it worked, as I said, up until 1914 and partially in the 1920s. But then, as the security situation in Europe collapsed in the 1930s, and then with the Second World War, I think it was clear that that is not a safe position to have, to be neutral and stay kind of disengaged. That has a major vulnerability to it. So instead, you need to build alliances. You need to get to build a profile for yourself internationally and build the right kind of alliances. And I think that's where we are today. Yeah. Okay. Next round.
Okay. Next question we have is from Dhaval, which says, how the feminist foreign policy of Sweden is different from Norway or Finland, as the Nordics face intense threats of new hybrid kind from Russia, such as cyber attacks, misinformation, etc. So what are the preparations and planning to counter them?
Yeah, good question. So first of all, I think there are these, I think what's the feminists, the Swedish feminist foreign policy is very much tied to, well, and now I'm a bit kind of biased, but it's very much tied to the Swedish Labour Party and to the former Swedish foreign minister called Margot Wallström, who came into office with this as her major political project. There's been no foreign minister ever, I think, that's come into office with very much explicitly having feminism as the central kind of organizing principle of foreign policy. That is really unique and interesting, but I think that has to do with really Margot Wallström as a leader and the kind of the network around her. And that has kind of made it unique and absolutely one kind of step above. I think from Finland and Norway, they also have these feminist elements into it. I think gender equality, using a lot of development aid towards kind of family planning, and lots of it arranged. I mean, for Norway, they spend a lot of money on women's education or girls' education, access to education, building that. So the way Norway spends money, and Finland as well, is in line with, I think, feminist values, but is not as explicit as Sweden. So that's the I think that's the short answer there. What would you add anything there, Anita? Or
no, I think you've taken it well.
Yeah, good. And then the second part of that question is, and then so the feminist policy is there, but it's not to say that these countries are not kind of behaving as normal powers in a way, and that is relates to the second part of your question on how are the Nordics facing intense threats of hybrid kinds from Russia, such as cyber attacks, misinformation, etc. And I think Finland is the one that has kind of Finland has been very active. They've been really educating their citizens. It's a whole, I think they're the best country in the world really in terms of building kind of digital resilience, of making sure that all of their citizens understand what is accurate information and what is inaccurate information, and really understanding when you have information campaigns that are actually disinformation. And I think the Finnish citizens are very alert to that, and that is happening to some degrees in Sweden and Norway, but not the same. So Finland is really the best one in that, and I think the other elements are just building. There's much more money spent on intelligence at the moment, and I think they are building up much more efforts when it comes to cyber issues. Generally, there's more money spent on it, but I'm not sure if we are extremely well prepared, or whether we've really cracked the code yet on that. And I think that is interesting. I think Russia clearly is doing this very well, and with very relatively little resources, they've come a long way, unfortunately, with this agenda. And this is something that will just grow in importance moving forward, I think. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. Next question we have from Dharma. It says, is Norway's growing relation with China affect the Norway-India over time due to ongoing India-China issues? If so, how?
What do you think? Should you go first on that one, Anita?
Well, Norway is very balanced in this kind of a thing. There's one thing it doesn't do is play one against the other. That's just not the Norwegian way of approaching anything, let alone foreign policy. So it will be two different tracks altogether, India and on one track and China at another level. And if anything, Norway would only try to, bridge some differences, reduce tensions, offer its, services. But of course, both India and China are too proud to take the services of Norway. But I don't see Norway ever, playing one against the other. It's just not part of its ethos.
Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah. So you do the time, you control the time.
Right on dot.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think we are done now with this, but thank you all so much. I see myself in all your faces. It's so nice to be here. And thank you so much, Stina, as always, refreshing and direct and to the point, and also very well informed. You just breathe all this stuff like a good professor should.
Thank you, Anita. I'm staying with you.
Thank you for this wonderful opportunity to be with you and the students.
I would like to thank both Ms. Stina and Ms. Anita for this great session. Now I would like to ask my colleague Nikhil Sehra to take up the session 3.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to the last speakers. I would smoothly transition to our next lecture now. I would request Jonatan to switch on his video so that we can add spotlight.
Hello, everyone. Can you see me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Perfect. Should I try to share my screen for my presentation? Should we try that first?
Yes, first let me introduce you to the...
Sorry, yes.
Okay. So the next lecture is on Sweden's feminist foreign policy. We have Jonatan Klum Stelander. He's a Swedish diplomat serving as second secretary at the political section at the Embassy of Sweden in New Delhi. He covers domestic politics in India, including issues related to democracy and gender equality. He also covers foreign, domestic, and trade policy concerning Sri Lanka and Maldives, countries which are side accredited to the Embassy in New Delhi. Before New Delhi, he has worked in the Department for European Security Policy at the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. He has also been part of Ministry's America Department and interned at the Swedish Embassy in Washington. Thank you for coming to the first Nordic Summer School. I hand it over to you, and yeah, you can share your thing.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm very glad to be included here tonight, and thank you for taking an interest in this topic. I will start by trying to share my screen so that we can get going with the actual presentation. Let's see.
I just wanted to say that it's a 30-minute lecture, and then we will shift to questions in the last 15 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, now can you see this?
Yes.
And do you see the entire picture, or do you see the notes, or what do you see the? Does this work? Let's see.
You can play it.
Let's see. Play from beginning, right? Maybe this works.
Yes.
Okay, so let's see. Now I don't see you, unfortunately, but that's maybe okay for now, at least. And I'll get back to you when we start. Okay, well, again, very glad to be included here tonight. My name is Johan Klimslander. I am a Swedish diplomat. I have been posted in New Delhi since August last year. So I'm relatively new here, and I cover, as Nikhil mentioned, domestic politics in India, but that also includes human rights. And I'm also the focal point for our Swedish feminist foreign policy. So that's why I'm kind of here to give you an overview of what that is and how we work with it worldwide, but also in India specifically. So the disposition of this lecture is the following way. I will go over the background, the objectives, framework, and also the results and our work in India. And then at the end, I will leave for a few minutes of questions, and you can feel free to ask anything that you wonder. And I'll be happy to do my best, at least, in answering what you would like to know about this. So let me move on here and start with the background. And obviously, one could start by asking himself why the need of a feminist foreign policy. And I think our last lecture actually touched upon this. It was the concept was formed and launched by our previous foreign minister, Margot Wallström, in 2014. And it was initially met with mixed reactions, actually a lot of criticism. The word feminism is quite controversial, and people rather discuss gender equality in a more traditional sense. But we were met with some resistance. But now, however, the policy is mostly met with curiosity and interest, and also appreciation. So then, the reason for us having feminist foreign policy is the short way to answer that is basically the status of gender equality in the world. We see that it requires a more forward-leaning approach. Although things are moving in the right direction on many fronts, huge gaps and challenges remain. Systematic subordination of women, discrimination, violence still mark the daily lives of countless women around the world. And that is despite binding conventions that have been signed, and a lot of the important work that has been done hasn't really been enough. So our foreign minister then believed that it takes something more to really bring about the change that we all have been trying to achieve. So she used to quote Mahatma Gandhi actually saying that first they ignore you, and then they laugh at you, and then they fight you, and then you win. So that was usually said, but it could be said in some ways about how this policy was received. So that is briefly the background to it. Moving on to the objectives, and I know the feeling of talking when you're reading at a slide, so I'll maybe give you just a few seconds to read these objectives that were laid out right when it was launched. And obviously these objectives are broad in order to kind of match broad challenges. It is hard to be also more specific when you're developing a policy plan for something that covers, you know, across continents, different contexts, the entire global agenda. And we want to bring kind of all our tools into play. That's why these are quite broad, but they're also mutually reinforcing. I mean, full enjoyment of human rights obviously goes hand in hand with looking at sexual and reproductive health and rights, for instance, and economic rights and empowerment is also connected in many ways to other forms. So these are the objectives, and moving on to the kind of framework, because if you're developing something like this, it's obviously, you know, relevant to ask yourself, why are we doing this? Why is it not enough to have gender mainstreaming foreign policy? I think you touched upon that a bit earlier as well, with other countries that may see this question as very important, but launching a feminist foreign policy is slightly different. And I'll try to explain why, because the way we see it, this is not an add-on or an ad hoc kind of perspective. It's supposed to be an integral perspective that kind of permeates all our areas in our foreign policy. So it's not designated to a group who work in one lane on gender equality. It's distinct, and it tries to kind of renegotiate some of the power hierarchies and gender institutions, as well as reformulating practices. So it's strong. It kind of signals a slightly stronger political commitment to gender equality, I would say, from the kind of consensus-oriented international language about gender equality or gender mainstreaming. So we used to say also that it's not about counting women, but making women count, which is very important. And the key can kind of be summarized in that it brings policy areas together, which makes it easier to coordinate, to have an impact, and to kind of involve the whole system and different partners that we are trying to reach with this. So building on that, to kind of find a structure to how we assess feminist foreign policy, or how we assess the world in which this is formed, we have down 3 R's that can kind of work as the guiding lights to our thinking and our work and our understanding around this. And these are rights, representations, and resources, 3 R's, and then the 4th one being reality. And I will kind of go through them briefly, as this is a way to structure and kind of get an understanding of how we analyze the situation. So going to rights here, the discrimination of women and girls mean that they still today not enjoy human rights fully. That's kind of the basic thing here. And as you see, women's rights, human rights. At the same time, still more girls do go to school today, but there are still at least 63 million who don't. There are a lot of different examples of how the rights are not being upheld throughout the world. 104 countries have laws preventing women from carrying out certain types of work. So this part kind of refers to the rights aspect, binding conventions that haven't been implemented, as well as looking at gender insensitive legal systems. The next one is representation, and it's also a very important one. You have some of the statistics there on the screen, but it's basically that the discrimination of women and girls mean that they still lack influence. It could be political influence, but it also includes all spheres in society. And for us, this has become particularly relevant when it comes to peace processes. Or we have decided to work a lot with this when it comes to peace processes, where women have often been excluded or non-active. And research has indicated that there's a clear correlation between women participation and sustainable peace. So peace negotiations, conflict resolution mechanisms, mediation, the entire ecosystem of peace building has seen clear results of being more equally distributed. So this is one area where representation is important, and we did work on that, for instance, in the United Nations Security Council. So this is the second R, and then the third one being resources. And it's basically the fact that women and girls still today lack resources to improve their lives. And this is an obvious and kind of concrete and tangible one, but it's, you know, the statistics are quite clear on this. I don't think majority of all countries have at least one legal difference between women and men, which limits women's opportunities. Some places, you know, the right to inherit land is taken away. Takes a lot of other forms as well. In our digitalized world, we see that 300 million fewer women than men own their own mobile phones. So this is obviously one of the really tangible aspects. Looking at that and realizing and acknowledging and countering is kind of a key to achieve any sort of tangible results. And then the fourth one is the reality, or some say it's a reality check. So this is the kind of systematic approach and lens that we use, these 3 R's. But it's not about coming into a country with a prefixed or a preconceived idea. It's also posing the question that you see on the screen. How does the reality for women and girls should be added, by the way, look in your local context? And this is really important because even if many patterns that I mentioned can be seen all over the world, the exact situation differs a lot and must be taken into account. So by acknowledging country-specific challenges, we can conduct our work more efficiently. And then next question is, how do we make this work, and what does it take to drive home a policy like this? And it's basically comes down to 4 main pillars here. Leadership is quite obvious. It's needed for leadership at the highest level in the organization. I mentioned our previous foreign minister, Margot Wallström, who was really driving this. And the reality is that our current foreign minister is also very, very keen on keeping this going. So it has not seen a shift in that regard. There's a strong political mandate still to keep running this. But that's a harsh reality too, that if you have a buy-in at the highest political level in a hierarchical organization like a foreign ministry, then people will kind of have to fall in line. Not necessarily, but it makes a huge difference having kind of top-level political support. Ownership is another thing. So it's basically allowing people to come in with their ideas, to allow people like me, for instance, who works with this in India, to say, this is how I see it working. This is, you know, what we could do here, and also to have this kind of attentiveness and to listen in on different ideas and listen to the line organization, so that everyone feels an ownership to develop this into something that we want to do. So that's very important. Third one, the guidance, refers to policy documents, to you know, key steps like writing their handbook or developing different plans. I think I sent you one in the readings, and that's obviously, you know, a key to actually make sure that there's you know, some kind of defined idea of what we're supposed to do, and an action plan basically. Although it has to be broad in order to cover these different dimensions. And then support, obviously, it's everyone's responsibility. I happen to be the focal point at our embassy, but it's a team effort, and a lot that's being done is being done also by my colleagues who work with innovation or trade promotion, and I kind of take the role of summarizing or watching it or holding it together, but it's something that everyone is invested in. That's also very important. So next one, I'm talking a little bit about, I would like to mention some of the results that we have seen already. And when it comes to results, we are working with this on every single continent and in the most of the bigger multilateral organizations. And when it comes to rights, if we start there, we continuously raise questions about women and girls' rights in negotiations, meetings, visits, dialogues. We continue to pursue contentious issues like sexual and reproductive health, which is a top priority. And we have done that successfully in different areas. We have been co-founders of She Decides and also put money there. And we support countries to ratify these different conventions that I mentioned before. When it comes to representation, we have promoted women's political participation in conflict prevention and peace processes. Our foreign minister also launched a mediation network to promote women's participation in peace processes. And we made women, peace and security a key priority for our term in the non-permanent membership of the UN Security Council. When it comes to resources, gender mainstreaming of budget allocation, for instance, is one thing. It also, it's about fighting discriminatory legislation, for instance, too. And we have increased our own support for development and humanitarian work, and increased the funding to She Decides, for instance. So it's also partly a question on inspiring broader developments. And we see that some of the developments have been inspired by our work. And I'll let you see the next slide here. And a few things that we've seen in terms of how we can inspire others. I mean, I should also say on a separate note that we are, after all, a small country, and we cannot turn the world upside down, but we can work systematically on some issues and some structures to make some difference and change some of the things that we see and inspire a different path. So I think that also needs to be said when I'm reading out all the achievements, and there are a lot of things that I'm not mentioning, but that's also a big part in this, that we're trying to push a change in the way that we assess these things. And as you can see on the developments, for instance, more countries are applying feminist foreign policies now, like Canada or France and Mexico. We see more ambassadors of gender equality who has the kind of focal point responsibility to follow this question, and a lot of other kind of opportunities and developments that are coming. So we see that, and we acknowledge that we also have to live up to our own standards. I mean, we have a feminist government. We also have to work on these issues at home to gain credibility, and that's also a continuous work. So that has to be said, and I think it's important. And we work also with our Nordic friends, and together we can achieve more, obviously. Next slide I would like to show you is an area called feminist trade policy, which is kind of an offspring to our feminist foreign policy, and the result of it being permeated into other areas of our foreign policy. So, for instance, applying this perspective can actually be quite a lucrative idea, because if you're bringing this perspective into trade as well, which is often one of the top priorities of any foreign policy, then you can actually see quite a substantial interest also, and you can achieve more with the kind of means that are there. And I mean, you see the few examples that are enlisted in the activity or in the slide there of what we have done and what we are doing, how we work with this. It's also something that I think EU used to do also in trade agreements with partners. Basically, you're saying that you know, we're doing this, but then we have this list of demands that we see happening, and that's also a way to kind of push development through a different vehicle, this time being trade. So this is something that has started, I think, a few years later, but it has been really up to speed, and it's an interesting angle. Now I don't want to talk too long in order to not give you enough time to questions, but I will just very briefly about our work in India as well. And the same way that the policy is permeated through all branches of our foreign policy, we kind of see that all sections of our embassy apply a gender perspective in its different focus areas, as I mentioned, from innovation, SHE-STEM initiatives to trade promotion. We are mentioning this when we discuss it with Indian counterparts, NGOs, schools, universities, plans. We do plans and projects and presentations, just like this one. So again, it's not an add-on. It's something that's permeating the work that we do on a day-to-day basis. You see the picture there is from International Day of the Girl Child, where we together with Plan India gave our social media platforms to a child who got to kind of get her message amplified by our social media platforms. So she could kind of use them to tell her story of hardships and stories that she had faced being a girl in India. That's just one example of many. And another thing is the kind of Wiki Gap Initiative. Maybe some of you have heard about it, but it's also, you know, a campaign through internet, basically seeing the imbalance distribution of articles on Wikipedia, and then we organized an editathon where we sit together, and Wikimedia was involved, and it started as a project in New Delhi. So basically, you sit together and you create pages about different women on Wikipedia to kind of equal out that gap. And it was actually a successful campaign that started in Delhi, and then other embassies have started doing it all over the world. So that's another way that you can kind of use this to be creative as well, which is fun. And then we have this project called Kraftsamla, started as a skilling project in Pune in 2018, aimed at skilling underprivileged women, and it has also been developed together with the Swedish Chamber of Commerce and the General Consulate in Mumbai. The important angle in this, connecting back to our feminist trade policy, is that this engages the Swedish business community and has been extended to incorporate gender sensitization projects, workshops, and working through the companies to see how we can best kind of reach out to women, also with regard to labor force participation, which is one issue or one challenge in India, I should say. So yes, before I finish, I just want to say that some of these numbers are disheartening, and the statistics of how skewed the balance still is, but I think that's how much can be done, and at least I personally get some solace from seeing how many people still care about this, and how many organizations, NGOs, other countries, individuals are engaged. And I think we have something important to work on. So thank you for taking the time listening to this, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much. Before, I would request you to stop sharing your screen. Before I take up questions, I would like Professor Bhaswati to thank you. And, yeah. Professor Bhaswati. Yes.
Hello, can you hear me now? Okay, it looks like I'm completely muted most of the time, and then they forget to unmute me, and I have no control over it. So I just wanted, on the behalf of the Center for European Studies, I wanted to thank Mr. Jonatan Klum for being with us here today and giving us a brief about the feminist perspective of Sweden's policy. I think what came out from your presentation, and which you reiterated time and again, is that it is not an add-on. That is interesting. It's not about numbers. It is not an add-on. It is something which is integral to the way in which this is valued, and then that value is being transferred also in the foreign policy level. I think this actually also connects very well with the first presentation that we had today, when Professor Wivel was talking about how the domestic values are translated into the foreign policy objectives and foreign policy aims, and that is what makes it more credible. It's not that you're not practicing it at home and then preaching it outside. So it's something which is very integral to your way of understanding your own value system, and then show putting it out as an example of what others can do. So thank you for taking us through this, and there are a lot of questions I can see, 12 at least. So please, I think Nikhil, go ahead and let us start the question and Q&A.
Yes, we have plenty of them. The first and foremost questions are like, what were the changes that had to be brought within the existing foreign policy in Sweden to incorporate a feminist framework, and what were the challenges faced by Sweden in this process? Was like two, three people have asked this, and what was there any opposition to this current policy?
Right, thank you for those questions and those opening remarks too. There were challenges. I personally did not work at the ministry when this was launched, but I have heard about a lot of them, and one of them was actually people who did not personally really believe in the effect of this. And from what I've heard, and I've talked to some of them, they have actually said, some of them have even gone to so far as to say that this is one of the most important projects they have ever worked on in their careers, and they are, seasoned diplomats. So, but obviously, swaying that and then understanding that there is some resistance at the get-go, so to say, is very important. And that was one of the main challenges that I heard of, so that people don't just think that it's a cliche, but that it's actually filled with something. You have to you have this label, feminist foreign policy, which is kind of, it shocks some people, to be frank. And then you have to fill it with the substance, and to do that early on is really important. And I think that was something that they worked quite efficiently on. So I guess that's what was the second part of or the first part of the question was?
What were the changes that had to be brought within the existing foreign policy to incorporate a feminist framework? Right.
I think we were still, just like many of our neighboring countries, applying a lot of these perspectives. So it's a good question in that regard. What's the difference? What happens the day after you decide to call it a feminist foreign policy? And I guess the answer to that question is, it's all, again, the part of it being an integral part. I mean, now it's everywhere within. So it's also on when you look at security, or when you look at practical aspects of our embassy work, it goes into that too. I don't know if that's, but that is kind of the core to this. I think you can run a project by doing something very focused for like 6 months, but if you really want to create a change that's long term, then you have to kind of just let it sink into different areas. And I think that's the way it has been done. And that's the way they have changed perspective. And then also, I mean, obviously, I mentioned the resources part. We are putting more money into this. We are also backing this economically a little bit more. So those two, I would say, are the main things.
Okay. So the second question is reservation an effective tool to increase women participation and representation? What policy decisions did Sweden take to increase women participation in political sphere?
Reservation, it really depends on the it depends a lot on the context, I would say. I mean, there has been discussions in different contexts where they have been saying that it creates a positive outlet in the beginning, but then it changes back, or it creates this imposter syndrome among some people. So it's hard to say on a general basis, but I would say that any way to kind of increase women's participation in political processes, they are, I mean, I don't say anyway, but it is a very difficult one because of that, because it depends on what context you apply. I mean, we work a lot with conflict resolution mechanisms in those areas where you have research to show it makes a difference. It makes a difference applying different perspectives. Should there be quotas or reservations to those? Maybe one should look at the recruitment process and just say, had there actually been enough effort to make sure that women apply for the same jobs? Because I mean, you're at university, and I was at university not too many years ago, and I remember, I mean, there's the students nowadays are more equal. There's especially in the diplomatic corps, we see young women entering a lot. So the balance, if we allow an equal playing field, the balance will equal out itself more and more, I think.
Okay. The next question is, how far Swedish feminist policy helps refugee women in Sweden? What are the ways it adopts in their integration process?
So the integration procedure is slightly different in the way that it is being, I mean, visas and asylum seekers, and it's not an integral part of the same kind of foreign policy lens that I'm discussing right now. It's obviously an issue to make sure that women who enter, for instance, get access to the labor market, and there are initiatives run by the social department, for instance, to watch how that can be done more efficiently, and to understand differences between arriving to Sweden as a man and a woman. But when it comes to strict migration areas and criteria, I should not go into the details, because I am not exactly aware of the details into how the kind of feminist foreign policy that I'm describing now, which is how our foreign ministry especially works, and the details of our migration system, which is dealt by the migration agency mostly.
Okay. So the next question says, the percentage of women in business in Sweden is impressive, and Sweden can really play as a soft power to engage with states on the topic of women in business. How is Sweden's foreign policy engaging on the issue of business and gender with India?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, for instance, we work with women in STEM, for instance. We have done that too. And that's a very fruitful cooperation. We have organized sessions, panel discussions, seminars on similar issues where there is like a possibility to meet in that field, for instance, science and innovation, not least. Trade promotion side has worked with Swedish companies who are in India, employing a lot of people. Also, that has been, as I mentioned, the last project, Kraftsamla, more about increasing labor force participation, but it's also about looking at gender issues, for instance. But you're right to say that small businesses and entrepreneurship is an important part in the kind of trade part of the feminist trade policy. And it has been, Sweden has supported different initiatives also worldwide when it comes to similar things. So very good question, good topic also to elaborate more on in what we could do with India. There are countless opportunities, I would say, working with India in this field. There's such potential. So it's actually quite a blessing to be able to work with this in India, I have to say.
Okay, so the next two questions are on similar lines. I'll club them. They are talking about that how has a feminist foreign policy helped in interacting with other states of the world, which are probably very conservative or patriarchal societies, and they would like to know of diplomatic successes that Sweden has seen since its adoption of a feminist foreign policy.
Right. So, I mean, one issue when it comes to, I mean, maybe I should start with the second one, diplomatic successes, because we were working a lot with women, peace and security in the UN Security Council. And that's one of the areas where we saw that we could add the amounts of women briefers, for instance, the UN Security Council. We started the Women Mediations Network and used science to kind of drive about that change. So that's one thing. We've also worked with political representation in states I actually have a document which outlines some of the successes that I have that has been achieved. So I could actually send that out because it has statistics and a little bit more. I don't want to kind of go into the details of something when I know that I have the paper and the documents that could answer this more specifically. But we have also worked for increased political representation, not least in Western Africa. So that's one thing. Sorry, what was the other part of the question?
Like what difficulties Sweden has faced in diplomatic, like while interacting with a conservative patriarchal state.
Right. So I mean, again, it goes back to the part in what I mentioned in the beginning. Like this was first laughed at a little bit. This feminist foreign policy. What is it? And that kind of attitude was lingering on for some time, and I think coming in with this policy is also it could alienate a little bit a country that that's a very common thing within values-based international issues. Generally, it could be sensitive when people or countries or political leaders are viewing it as you're trying to impose something. So it's really important to go in with the right attitude. And I know we have been driving SRHR questions a lot, and I know that we have achieved some success, but it's also been difficult in some countries to talk about contraceptives and abortion and those issues. So that could be one example.
Okay, so yeah, so the next two questions are talking about, do you think more women representation in global affairs can lead to world peace and more resolution than conflict?
Yeah, that's a good one too. I mean, personally, I think that it definitely makes a difference having a more equal playing field. Generally, I think that makes so much sense in every single way. I mean, just as political leaders, you want to be able to have all kinds of experience at the table. I mean, for instance, when they were drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there were only 2 women there. And Indian activist Anita Mehta was one of the ones who kind of pushed some language in there when she saw that it was being written in a gender skewed way, kind of. So, I mean, obviously it makes a difference. And I guess the kind of thing about world peace is taking it to the extreme a little bit, but it could definitely benefit from people with different experiences being in charge, and that goes for all spheres of society, also business leaders and other actors.
So the next 3 questions are based on India, and they are asking like, what are the lessons India can take from Sweden with regards to its foreign policy and improvement of women's representation and life in India?
Sorry, what was I didn't quite hear you.
Okay, so the next question is based on India. The 3 questions are asking like, what type of policy suggestion would you give to India to improve its women representation and the life of women in India?
I see. So, I mean, what we say in our feminist foreign policy is not necessarily to, I mean, it's difficult for me to sit as a diplomat and come up with policy suggestions of how things should be done in India. I mean, it's a difficult one, and I don't necessarily want to go into that. I think there's a lot of potential as in India, as in a lot of other places, including Sweden. And when you include women's political participation, when you give them the resources and the rights that they have earned, you will see results. You will see results of unleashing the potential of the entire population. So that goes for India, it goes for Sweden, it goes for a lot of other countries that we want to see. We want really leaders to be inspired by that possibility to actually to get to that point where you can be more equal and you can achieve more things together. And it's something that's beneficial for everyone. So I will answer it that way.
Okay. So one more question is, so I think these are one of the few last questions. How the feminist foreign policy of Sweden answers the postmodernist standpoint, which mentions that often upper middle class white women's issues are taken up and superimposed on other societies. So how do you think that feminist foreign policy of Sweden is more inclusive, like, is it with respect to other races and people?
Right. Actually, I realized I have all the questions here on the chat, I guess, so I could see them when you're so I don't have to with this hearing. I guess this is one of the last ones, right?
Yeah, primary gun.
There it is. Yeah, I see it. But often upper middle class white women, which is, I think, interesting, very interesting angle to that question. I think that the Swedish feminist foreign policy doesn't necessarily go into all the different post-modernist different standpoints. It's a very valid point to raise, I think. Who are we actually discussing when we talk about women and girls, for instance? And because that could be different if you're only assessing it from a white middle class woman's perspective. But I think, again, I mean, for instance, when we launched this initiative that I mentioned in India with the International Day of the Girl Child, we are discussing women and girls all over the world in different continents. So since it's such a foreign feminist foreign policy, we are reaching down to local contexts a lot, which is important. So that's why I think it's an important question to raise, because if we would have assessed everything in the same lens that maybe Swedish women see society at home, then we might miss points that are relevant to other contexts out there in the world, in India and in other places. So good question, and I think we haven't. We're to be honest, it's one of those. It's a good point to raise, but it's I think we are covering some of that through the way that we work and through the way that we are reaching out to women all across the world and asking them. Also, being genuinely interested is important. How do you see this? Talk to experts, talk to politicians, talk to NGOs, talk to people who know this, and that way, that kind of white middle class perspective, or how it was mentioned, could be reduced a little bit at least, and other angles can get some more space and get So that, I think that's.
Okay, I have an extension to that question, like, because everybody is talking about binaries of gender when they're talking about a feminist foreign policy. Like, how, like, does Swedish feminist foreign policy also is looking towards inclusivity towards other genders and other sexualities, or is it just focusing on women?
It definitely brings out LGBTQ rights, for instance. We have been following those issues for quite some time. So that's definitely part of the same umbrella of questions that we look at. So that's the kind of the short answer to that question. It definitely includes that too. I could have mentioned it more clearly in my presentation. It also takes up issues such as gender roles. We had this kind of cultural / public diplomacy a project or initiative called Swedish Dads, which showed how dads who took parental leave, for instance, it was like a photo exhibition of that, and then it was done in different countries. And we did Delhi Dads here in New Delhi, for instance. So, gender roles, and not only it goes both ways, right? It's about having a change from both sides, or from many sides, basically. So that's that's also important and part of what this perspective includes.
Thank you, Mr. Jonatan, and we would request you share that document where the successes of Swedish foreign policy is mentioned. I would I really thank you for coming, and I would like Christabel from Nordic Center of India to come in and she make a comment. And
thank you too, and thanks for all of the questions. Really good questions, and I'm glad that you spent this Monday afternoon with me here. It's late evening Indian time, but it's still fun to do this. Thank you.
I won't take too much of your time. I just wanted to quickly thank Jonathan for his time with us today. I think overall it's been a gratifying first day, starting with the Ambassadors Roundtable, where the bilateral focus areas and strategic interests were highlighted and laid out. And now with the lectures of Anders, Stina, Anita, and Jonathan, you've clarified the context with your very informative and inspiring lectures. Many thanks to everybody who's been with us today and for making day one a success. And we at the Nordic Center, as well as all our colleagues at JNU who are organizing this program, I think we're all looking forward to a satisfying day two. Thank you very much.
Professor Sarkar.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, I think Christabel has, am I muted or unmuted?
No, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So I think Christabel has summed it up very well, that we have had a very fruitful day one. And I'm sure that other days will, because this is like morning shows the day. So this has gone well, which means that everybody is energetic and enthused that we are going to know more about the Nordics in the coming days. So looking forward to tomorrow. And please sign in the attendance form if you want your certificates. This is for all the participants. Take care, stay safe, bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you all the participants. Don't forget to fill up your form. Thank you, Jonatan, again. Thank you, Christabel, and thank you, Professor Sarkar. And with this, we'll end the day one of summer school.
Thank
See
you.
you tomorrow.
So I end meeting for all.
Yeah.
Host
Yes,
you. Okay, thank you very much. It's been fantastic. Thank you.
Let people are like sending in thank you, so we can wait.
So I'll wait. Hold on.
Okay, that is some for some.
We can wait if people have any
Thank
other.
you. The team is fantastic. You'll run things so smoothly. So that's really cool too. So thank you. Thank you to Professor Sarkar and thank you to the team.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christabel.
Thank you,
Will I
Christabel.
end it?
Yeah, I think so, yes.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
So we meet tomorrow again at 5:30,
Yes.
right? 5:30 tomorrow, right? Okay. Bye-bye. Good night. Take care.
Good night.
Good night.